Hello and welcome to a new episode of Convert on Shopify. My name is Pancho Mendiola and today Johan is back. And we are turning an not so sexy topic into a really sexy topic. We want to get you interested in these not so sexy parts of A/B testing and CRO and basically e-commerce. And today we're discussed about hypotheses, why they are so important and how to formulate a proper hypothesis to get better results in your store. So let's jump right in. Hey Johan, you're back. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that. And we're just talking in the green room, right? That today the topic is hypothesis, which just by the sound of it, you're like boring. And we were saying that it's not the sexiest conversation, but sometimes you need stuff that isn't sexy, you know. What do you think about that?
Yeah, it's definitely not the sexiest topic in the industry, and it reminds a little bit of science classroom, right? Because that's where most of us first got introduced to this concept, hypothesis, and it's in a boring way. It's a bit academic, theoretical, um, and so we associate this term hypothesis with science, a science classroom, and with something that doesn't really have practical value, certainly not in a business context. And I think that that's where a lot of us get it wrong.
I totally agree. And okay, why is it that you think that we get drawn to the sexy stuff, but that doesn't actually work?
Well, it's not to say that the sexy stuff doesn't necessarily work, and also, we each have our own definition of sexy. So, I don't think talking about hypotheses and hypothesis formulation and all this stuff is unsexy, but I've bored enough people with it to know how it lands. Where I agree with you is, it's not just the things that we regard as sexy that are important. Sometimes we have to pay attention to other adjacent areas of our thinking that we might not be as interested in, but that are equally as important.
All right, all right. I agree. I can agree with that. So now that we have established, let me tell you what I agree. So in my agency, we don't do any of the sexies, right? We do all we regard ourselves more as mechanics. So maybe if you were to just like drop in, you would find us maybe with a onesie or a coverall, you know, and our fingers all messed up with oil. Uh, so that's how we think ourselves in what we do, right? We tend to be more like in the background, and our the type of stuff we do, it's most of the time black and white, you know. It's just like looking at numbers, looking at sheets, and that's not sexy. That sexy people think. I think what people regard as sexy is, this like super creative, super out there with these Mad Men style, campaigns where you come up just with a killer idea and everything just like flies to the roof. And we in the business, we know that that's not how it actually works. So one of the not sexies is precisely hypothesis. So I would like to know, now that we established that, how can we start? Like why? Well, first of all, why is it important to start with a hypothesis?
Yeah, why is it such a big deal? Why do we need to talk about unsexy topics? Um, I think here's the thing: if you run A/B tests, then it matters. It matters because in many cases, not in all cases, but in many cases, perhaps in most cases, in CRO, hypothesis is the foundation of an A/B test. So if you skip that step, or you treat it as a checkbox exercise, or you do it, so half-heartedly, then you set up a weak foundation. And we all know what happens down the line with a weak foundation. And I've seen this in practice. My role involves choppering in and out of CRO programs, not just in our agency, but externally as well. And often where I've seen programs that have gone, where things have gone not necessarily wrong, it's not necessarily that dramatic, but certainly it's not the results that you would expect, or there are clear signs of um, where things can be improved, then often I found that you can trace it back to that step, the hypothesis. And so I've come to realize over time, I didn't necessarily believe this 10 years ago, but I've come to realize through experience that this is often the root of issues in a testing program, in a CRO program, and it's because it creates a really weak foundation if it's not done properly.
All right. So even before testing, someone has to sit down and write some stuff, in black and white. So before writing a hypothesis, I would guess that it all starts with an insight, right? And from that insight, then you develop the hypothesis. Is that correct?
Yeah, you're right. It can happen in various ways, and sometimes it's even retrospectively. But typically, the scientific method, right? You start with data. Data in its raw form is useless. It's just numbers and quotes and statements, and it's things that you can observe. From data, you have to draw insights. Now, that's where you start layering a level of human intelligence on top of it. It's your inference, right? So you and I can look at similar data and walk away with different inferences. But you move from data to insight, and then from insight to idea, and then from idea to testing. And what comes between the two is the hypothesis. Now, can you run a test without creating an hypothesis? Of course you can, and it's done, and it's done a lot. You also, let's say this to each other: not every test needs an hypothesis. But if let's take a step back and just define what exactly an A/B test is, and what it allows you to do, what value it offers you. It is a randomized controlled trial. RCT is the fancy word for it. And what it's designed to do is to allow you to establish cause and effect, right? So you can establish that causal relationship between two different variables. So A leads to B. And with no other research method, or very few, certainly experimentation, controlled experimentation is one of the best ways in which to establish that causal effect between two different variables. And if that's what you're trying to do, then, and with A/B testing, often it is what you're trying to do, then if you don't set up an hypothesis to govern what that test looks like, to design that test, things will fall flat. And what I see as well is it's not really, you spoke about writing it down black on white. And of course, that's how it plays out. It's not really writing down the hypothesis that is so powerful. It is the act of thinking about the hypothesis in writing it down. That is the powerful bit. That is the bit that by being forced to go through that thought process where you think about all these moving parts in the hypothesis and how you string them together, that's how you arrive at a position where you've designed a well-constructed experiment where everything is set up correctly and there's not going to be any issues down the line. You know what you're tracking, you know what you're testing, you know what you'll learn at the end, you know what action you'll take, regardless of the outcome of the test. All of this happens as a result of having thought about the hypothesis, not necessarily having written down the hypothesis. But of course, that's what you want to do.
Yeah, so the writing it is just the constraint, right? So for example, with a tweet, when in the old times when it used to be only 140 characters, it was a lot of thinking to get it down to just that amount, right? And then you would get in the tweet, you would get like a concentrate of an idea, and I think it's kind of the same because ideas are cheap. Everyone can have an idea. I mean, people have ideas all the time. yeah, we should do this, yeah, we should do that. But from getting to from an idea to an actual let's say a project, that's it takes time. And for me it's writing it down. For example, with my team, I mean, not specifically with A/B testing, but we have a process. You want your idea to go into the pipeline. You need to formulate that idea properly, and you need to do it in writing. And from there we can help you, give it a little bit more flair with images, with a mood board. But the first step is get it in writing and explain yourself in writing, and from there we can go on. And people often, what they do is, okay, it's actually not a great idea. So or in this case it would be like, maybe it's not worth testing. Or if it's positive, you'll be a lot more clear, like you said, in what's the expected outcome, where should we test, or how, like maybe you can increase the amount of resources that you will invest in that specific hypothesis. So what's the best way? I don't know, there's not like one correct way to do it, but in your experience, what's the best way to formulate a hypothesis?
I'll give you the answer to that just now, and maybe in the show notes you can put a resource to. There's a blog post on Medium written by Craig Sullivan, which is a really good resource to refer to. He did a lot of work on this with some other people in the industry, and I think what they've proposed there is a good way of doing it. But just quickly taking a step back and picking up on what you said earlier there, I think part of the role of the hypothesis is exactly that. And I've seen this in my own work many times, is that, and again, it's about going through this thought process in constructing an hypothesis, that you maybe think about the idea very differently once you've started constructing a hypothesis around it. It allows you to spot the weaknesses, the gaps, or it forces you to shape the idea slightly, because the way it's been formulated as an idea is not quite ready to be thrown into a test. And that's the problem. If you skip that step, or if you go over a light touch and you take that idea badly formulated or not precisely formulated and construct a test out of it, this is where you start tracking the wrong stuff. You end up not even testing the right variables, and at the end, you're drawing a conclusion from it, but really it's not as precise or robust as you would have done otherwise. To answer your question about what is a good way to construct an hypothesis, I'll give you the very short version. It's basically the following. It starts with "we believe."
Okay.
And the reason that's important, that statement "we believe," is because you're declaring an assumption. Everything in business is based on assumptions. I mean, that's the reason we test. We're not entirely sure. There's a lot of uncertainty around new ideas and innovations and optimization as well. And we know from testing that we get it wrong a lot of the time. So we're declaring that assumption up front. And
Nice.
we're open to the possibility of being wrong. I mean, again, that's the point of testing. So it starts with "we believe." And then the second part is X will lead to Y, or A will lead to B, or however you want to think about it. But it's those two variables. It's that causal relationship, the cause and effect that you want to spell out. So we believe X will lead to Y. Let's think of an example, CRO. And I'm going to try not to use the classic button color. But let's say we believe that increasing the size of the product image on the PDP will increase whatever it is, click-through rate or add to basket rate. But just saying that statement illustrates how important it is to think through this. What is that effect? So the change, the one variable, is increasing the size of the image. What do we think will be the effect of it? And what you'll often find is, and here's an example of a weak hypothesis, or a hypothesis that's not well thought through. So you say, we believe that increasing the image size on the PDP will double our conversions, or will increase our conversions, or will increase revenue per user. How? What is? How do you explain that? What is the link between increasing the image size and money being spat out on the other side? There's something missing in between. And usually that's user behavior, right? So let's take another step back. I think this is useful. What we're trying to do in CRO is we're trying to improve a metric typically. Well, it's usually a constellation of metrics. Now, that could be conversion rate, it could be AOV, it could be RPV, and typically it's a number of things. But that metric, let's work with conversion rate, is really just a reflection of user behavior. It is what it is. You can't change that. You're looking in the rearview mirror. As soon as you look at a metric, it's the rearview mirror. It's already happened. You can't influence it. What you can do is you can shape the human behavior, the consumer behavior, and by shaping that behavior, that gets reflected in the metric. So what you're trying to do is not change the metric, you're trying to change human behavior. And so we start by forming a world of the customer. That's our first theory. And this comes from data, from GA, from Hotjar, from customer interviews, usability testing, typically a combination of those things. It could even be gut. But we start with that view of the world of the customer. And then on top of that, we form a theory about how we can improve that world of the customer. That becomes our hypothesis. It is that you're trying to pin down. How do we improve the world of our customer? A will lead to B. And then the third part is how do you measure it? How will we know this is true? So we believe A will lead to B. We will know it's true if we observe X. And that's the basis of an hypothesis. You should have more than that, but if you have that, you've written an hypothesis.
Wow. Okay. So I was doing it wrong all this time. First of all, that's a big change. Yeah, because we tend to formulate the hypothesis with the expected outcome, not and like you said, in a lot of these metrics, they can't move, or it's really hard. I mean,
Well, they can
uh,
move. The metric will move. The metric will move. But what you're doing is you're not touching the metric.
yes,
You're touching the thing that leads to the metric moving.
exactly the that's the outcome, right?
Yeah.
So and there's a step in the middle, which is that we are trying to influence behavior, and that was all right. That was missing in my all right. I love that.
But this is the thing, Pancho, and this is what I'm saying, that the thinking about the hypothesis is actually more important than the writing of the hypothesis itself. And by the way, by that I'm not saying don't write down your hypothesis. Definitely write down your hypothesis. But it's thinking through it that forces you to identify these variables. And usually the easy bit is the independent so the thing that you're changing, making, in this case, making the image larger, changing the button color if you want to be silly. That's the easy one to identify because that's your idea. The other easy one to identify is the metric that you want to move. But usually there's a gap between the two because what is that link and what is that chain of events that connects this thing that you're changing, the one variable, to the metric that you're really interested in? And the way you answer that in many cases, maybe in most cases, is what is the user behavior that I'm changing? How will I measure that? And then you can tell a story around how changing that user behavior will shape the ultimate metric. And that's, let me just add also that you'll never in a test have just one metric. Your primary metric is the one that you'll use to declare the test, determine the result, determine the outcome of the test. And that's what the hypothesis helps you to identify. Because now once you've been able to put your finger on that effect variable, then you can say, how do we measure this? That becomes your primary metric.
So now that you have identified your primary metric, obviously when one metric moves, normally other metrics move as well, right? For example, with if your add to cart moves, normally your reach checkout moves, and by default, your conversion metric also moves. So how can we know that there's a link, or which other metrics we can check?
Yeah, and that's not always the case. And the other thing we taught in science classes at school is that there's correlation and causation are not the same thing. And again, an A/B test helps you to to establish that cause and effect, unlike any other method. But you'll have a bouquet of metrics. Your primary metric, we've already spoken about that. Then you'll have secondary metrics and guardrail metrics. Let's start with guardrail metrics. So let's say in your example there, you are using add to cart as a primary metric, right? So that's the effect in your hypothesis. That's what you believe the user behavior you will change, and that's how you measure it. But what you want to avoid is for your revenue or your overall site conversion rate to drop. So that becomes a guardrail metric. That's something you monitor, and it can be flat, but it can't be south. It
Of
can't be
course.
negative. If that drops, then even if you get an uplift in add to cart, you're not going to roll out this change on the site.
Yeah,
So that's
to
the
give
guardrail metric.
an example, so maybe you want to increase your average order value, but in order to do so, you did some, some crazy upsells and cross sells and whatever, and maybe you increased it, but then you reduce the number of orders, and if you multiply it, then your revenue dropped. So that's not a good thing, right?
And that happens. And that
Yeah.
happens. There are many reasons why you want to have a distinction between these two metrics. Um, in the context of what we're talking about, the hypothesis helps you to define that primary metric, that effect that you are measuring. But it's also usually more difficult to get to detect a swing on those metrics like conversion rate and revenue, for reasons that are the topic of another conversation on its own. And so it's useful to measure that user behavior, especially if your site doesn't have a lot of traffic. Now, the other class of metrics that you want is the secondary metrics. So those are metrics around user behavior, in this journey, in this experience that you're changing, that you're testing, and it'll be different for every test. But maybe in this case, let's think about the example you mentioned. So you spoke about add to cart. So maybe there are clicks you can monitor. Maybe you can monitor progression to the next step. Maybe they go to the cart page next. So that's a step in the journey you can monitor. And if you've got a couple of monitoring metrics or secondary metrics, what it allows you to do is to construct a story around this test. So whatever happens with your primary metric, whether it goes up or down, the secondary metrics allow you to figure out why that may have happened. It enables you to plot that journey throughout this experience that you're testing. So you're not just looking at this one primary metric. It goes up or down, and you don't really know what the story is behind it. So you want to aim for that primary metric, a bouquet of secondary metrics, and then definitely the guardrail metric that you don't want to see going south.
All right. Well, this was such a masterclass. I wrote everything down, and I hope the people listening did as well. So I thank you very much for that, and also I'm really excited about the next conversation about how to start your program. And again, thanks a lot for your time and for this amazing information that you're sharing with us.
Good to talk to you again, Pancho. Look forward to the next time.
Awesome. Well, there you have it. You know Johann delivers. So I really hope you enjoyed this conversation. I did myself. I wrote everything down. And remember, feel free to drop in Convert.com. We have tons of resources, a lot more information about A/B testing and conversion rate optimization. Reach out and see you in the next one. Bye bye.